If you're in a band or you're a sound guy, you want the best sounding show possible. Or at least I would assume so since you're watching Sound Advice. My name is Barry. I'm a sound engineer in the Minneapolis, Twin Cities area. And I'm here to give you a simple tip as to how you can get more consistent sound throughout your venue. Now, normally when you think of getting good sound for a show, people think that this is the art of adjusting the level of all of the different instruments on stage, be it the drums, the guitars, the vocals, the keyboards, and whatnot, so that they're all blended together well and it produces a pleasing result. And there's certainly truth in that. And just exactly how you go about doing that is a little bit artistic, a little bit subjective, and I'll cover all of that in an upcoming video as to my technique that I use to get a good sounding band mix. But that's just my opinion, my mix. Your mix may be a little bit different. That's okay. But there's another thing which I think is just as important as getting the mix right, and that is getting the spectral balance of the band right. If you're mixing a band and there's too much high frequency energy, it's like really too much treble and it's crispy and harsh, that's going to drive the audience out. If there's too much mid-range, people will be uncomfortable. If there's any part of that audio spectrum where there's too much energy, people are not going to be happy and they're not going to want to stick around for your show. Now, how could this happen? Well, it could happen because you have a musician who has a opinion as to what their sound should be, which is a little bit outside of the mainstream, okay? So it could be a guitar player who just likes that really high frequency, high crunchy guitar sound, and they think it just cuts. And it does, but that energy around 3 to 4K is really delicate. I mean, people are sensitive to those frequency ranges, and if your guitar has a lot of really high frequency crunchy noise in it, boy, that can just be really stressful for the audience. So you have to watch that stuff. Same thing with drummers who play a lot of metal during the show. Every time you come down to that crash cymbal, you kind of wipe out the band for a second, and too much of that stuff can just drive your audience out of the venue. If you have a bass player who's got his bass amp cranked way up on stage and it's just filling the room with bass, that's not going to be a comfortable show. But a lot of musicians are really quite well seasoned and they have a good tone to their instruments. And if you have good instrument sounds on stage, you're using microphones that have good frequency response, and you have a loudspeaker system that has good reproduction across the whole range, and you're not cranking up any kind of silly EQ on the mixing board, the show should naturally be pretty balanced, you'd think, right? Well, one factor that always steps into the equation is what the room does to you. The room acoustics is always an issue that you have to work around and make the best of. And if you talk to sound engineers about shows that they weren't really happy with the sound, more times than not, they start giving excuses or platitudes about, the room was super difficult to work with because of its acoustical characteristics. So in this video, I want to give you a tip as to how you can handle some of these room issues and make the best of it. Now, oftentimes we don't have a lot of control over the room that we're working in, and we have to do what we can with a PA system to overcome those issues in the room. I'm going to break this down into the high frequency and the low frequency parts. The high frequency parts, which are your tops, fortunately are relatively directional. And if you have good loudspeakers, quality speakers, they should be relatively constant directivity, which is that everything from the mid-range frequencies to the very high frequencies have about the same polar pattern of distribution coming off that box. And so we can aim those boxes to get the sound to the audience and try to minimize the amount of sound that's bouncing off of the nearby walls. And so you want to make sure that the boxes are pointed to the best of your ability into the audience, which is relatively sound absorbent. And so it'll hit the people, it'll be absorbed by the people to some degree, and it won't just scatter around the room and bounce and reflect and come back and create basically a comb pattern interference, which makes things ugly. Of course, depending upon the room that you're in, you may want to make choices as to the loudspeakers, if you have a choice, between the width of those horns so that you can get the best projection into your audience without spraying sound unnecessarily to other places where the audience is not at, and which will not be productive and conducive to the best show possible. Now, when it comes to the lower frequencies, your subwoofers, those have much larger wavelengths and actually start to interact with the dimensions of the room. And we can have some impact on those by where we move those speakers around. Now, one of the good things about the low frequency system is below about 150 hertz, and those low frequencies, the sound is difficult for our ear brain to localize because the distance between our ears is relatively small compared to the wavelengths involved. We just tend to get enveloped by the sound, and we don't have the ability to really clearly localize where it's coming from. So to some extent, the placement of the low frequency subwoofers is not quite so critical. Now, obviously, there's going to be a larger sound pressure level near the boxes as opposed to further away from the boxes. So we don't want to put the subwoofers on the opposite side of the room, but we can move them to and fro somewhat without really impacting the show all that much. Now, because the wavelengths of the woofers are so long, they can be in the range of several to many feet, depending upon the frequency involved. They start to actually interact with the size of the room. Now, the wavelengths coming off the tops are usually in the range of a foot to an inch, and so they just kind of spread out to the room and fill that area with sound pressure. But the low frequency system actually starts to engage with the dimensions of the room. And so let's do a quick segue and imagine it's a gorgeous summer day and we're walking down to the park, and we go down to the park and there's a pond and there's a boat dock out there. So we walk out on the dock and we drop a pebble into the lake. And it's a nice calm day and there isn't any waves in the lake. And when we drop a pebble in, what do you see? Well, you see a circular wavefront move out from where that hits the water, and it moves away from the point of impact out towards the edge of the lake. And sound will move through air somewhat like water waves. And so if there's a single point source, such as a single pebble being dropped into the lake, it moves out from that point and fairly evenly fills the area with waves. But if we were to take two pebbles, one in each hand, and simultaneously drop both of them into the lake, well, both of them are going to create a circular wavefront coming out, and those waves between the 2 points of impact will collide in the middle, and they will interact with each other. And if the two waves are both on an upward swing when they impact, they're going to add together and be even more powerful. If, on the other hand, because of the luck of the distance, off of pebble number 1, the wave hits, and pebble number 2, the wave hits, and they join each other. But if one wave is going down while the other wave is going up, when they collide and merge, they're going to cancel each other out, and you will get nothing at that point. So the two wavefronts are going to collide together, and depending upon the exact geometry of where they are, they're going to either add together or subtract from each other. And so there will be interaction between the two wavefronts of the point sources involved. And the same thing will happen with your subwoofers. And so if you have a typical stage situation where you have a stage and you have a speaker system on either side of that stage, well, the wavefronts from both of those woofer systems are going to come together at the middle and start interacting with each other. And of course, because they have wavefronts that propagate throughout the entire room, both of those wavefronts at all points in the room are going to have some interaction with each other. And what's going to happen in most cases is you're going to receive an effect that a lot of sound guys refer to as power alley, which means that if you have a stage and you have a speaker system on one side of the stage and a speaker system on the other side of the stage, in the middle, you will get very strong, pronounced bass. And then as you move off from the middle to the sides, you will find nulls where there's very weak bass. And if you actually were to plot out the pattern, you may find that it's kind of a comb type effect where down the middle it's a really strong band of bass, followed by bands of weak bass, followed by another band of strong bass, weak bass, and so forth and so on. Now, of course, if the room has walls in it, like most rooms do, ceilings and floors, the sound is going to hit those surfaces and come back, and that will also act like a source. And so all of this stuff is going to start interacting, and it's going to give you spotty, uneven bass throughout the room because you have multiple sources of energy. Now, this can be used to our effect, or to our advantage, I should say, in large concert situations where high-end providers providing large concerts will work with this effect intentionally by creating clusters of woofer systems that are appropriately spaced apart and appropriately delayed so that they work together where you want them to work together, and they'll cancel each other out where you don't want powerful bass. And so you can create cardioid subwoofer arrays by being very careful with subwoofer spacing and the timing of the signals driving into those woofers to do things such as provide strong bass to your audience, but yet not provide overwhelming bass to the performers on stage or behind the stage. But for the purpose of this video, I'm talking to people who are doing small bands in bars and VFWs and the like, and you're probably not working with large numbers of subwoofers and complicated delay systems that do that sort of thing. So here's the tip. If you have a single point source for your woofers, it will more or less spread out evenly throughout the venue and give everybody consistent bass sound. If you have two sources, it's going to be much more difficult to provide clean, even bass throughout the venue. So the tip is to cluster your subwoofers together into a group, either in the center of the stage or off to one side of the stage, and that will provide much more even bass for your audience. Now, sometimes what I'll do, just because it's mechanically convenient, is I'll have subwoofers on the left side and the right side of the stage, and maybe they are holding up your tops, but I will only power one side, and the other side I'll just use as a large box to hold stuff up, but it isn't really producing subwoofer energy. And in a lot of smaller venues, a single subwoofer system is more than enough output to cover the room. So if you just turn off one of your subwoofers and use one as power, you'll probably get smoother, even bass throughout your venue and better sound for your audience. Another thing to be aware of is when you cluster your woofers together, they have acoustical gains. I mean, obviously two speakers are louder than one, but when you put them together physically, they couple together acoustically and give you a few more dB of power. So there's an advantage to actually grouping your system together, and those boxes have to be within a wavelength of each other, which is within a handful of feet, for most of your bass range. So if you just scoot those two boxes together, you'll get more bass. Same thing with a wall. If you have a wall and you have your woofer alongside that wall, effectively, imagine if you would that wall is a mirror and it creates a reflection right on the other side of it. So if I was to have a wall and a speaker right here, that would be the equivalent of having another speaker right on the other side of the wall. And so that couples together. And so if I have a wall nearby, I will scoot my woofers right up next to that wall, right against it, and you'll get acoustical gains by doing that. So you get more power without using more power. But likewise, if I have a wall here and I have a speaker that's some distance away from that wall, well, the sound's going to hit the wall, reflect back, and that will have the acoustical equivalent of having another. So if my speaker is 4 feet away from this wall, it'll be the acoustical equivalent of having another speaker on the other side of that wall 4 feet away. And then again, that's 2 point sources of sound that interact with each other and create uneven bass throughout the room. So the trick there is you want to be right against the wall, or if you can't be against the wall, don't be against the wall. Get as far away as possible from all of the other boundary surfaces that you're dealing with. So if I had a choice of being right against the wall, or 3 feet against the wall, or 12 feet from the wall, well, I would be right against the wall. But I'd rather not be 3 feet. If that's my only choice, then I'll choose 12 feet away so that the wall isn't interacting with my woofers. So there's a tip for you, friends, about how you can place your subwoofers, which will give you even, smooth bass coverage throughout the room, because we don't want any real big peaks or valleys in our audio spectrum for the audience. Now, if I have to make a choice between a peak or a valley, I'll take the valley. Because if I have a peak in the range somewhere, I have too much mid-range, I have too much high frequency, or I have too much bass, our ear-brain system can't ignore that. And it's irritating to the audience. It's stressful, and they won't be happy with your show. But if there's a valley, That is, the system is lacking in a certain range of the mid-range, or it's lacking in a certain range of the highs. And hopefully that range that it's lacking in isn't too wide in bandwidth. If it's just kind of a narrow dip somewhere in there, chances are your audience probably won't even hear it. Because things that are missing, our ear brain is pretty good at just kind of filling in the details. You know, it's sort of like looking at a television picture where when you stand back 10 feet away from the television, it looks like a beautiful picture. But if you were to get right up to the screen with a magnifying glass, you might notice that that picture is really made up of a lot of little tiny colored dots. And so the picture is not smooth and completely filled in and consistent. But it looks fine once you get back a ways and our brain system is able to fill in all the missing little details, and we don't even notice it. But if there's way too much green or red in that picture, well, we can't get rid of the excess, and we will see it. Same thing with sound. So if you have to make a choice, I'll choose a dip rather than a peak. But of course, smooth, flat response is the best of all. Now, how do you tell if your system is reproducing sound with a smooth, flat response? Well, with experience, you can listen to the system and you pretty quickly know, oh, there's just too much highs and too much mid-range or whatnot. Although the fact is our acoustical memories are really quite short. We can listen to a loudspeaker system and say, yeah, sounds all right, until we flip over a switch to another loudspeaker system, which is much better. And at that point, we go, oh, wow, that really is a lot better. And you, at that point, realize the deficiencies in the original system. So even though I'm pretty experienced, I don't completely trust my acoustical memory. I can listen to a loudspeaker system and pretty quickly ascertain whether or not it's good or not, but just exactly how good, it's hard to know without being able to compare against a reference. Obviously, there are some good tools out there. You can get RTA applications for your smartphone, which will show the spectrum, and some of these are even free. And although that might not be considered a precision piece of equipment, most phones these days are surprisingly good, and it's probably good enough to take a quick look at that spectrum and see if there are any ranges of it which are consistently high in energy. Now, be aware that most smartphones have some deficiencies in the low end. So under 100, 200 hertz, I would suggest that that may be a little dubious if you're not using a proper calibration mic. But for most of the range, you can probably look at it and see if there's any parts that are consistently showing too much energy. And what the proper curve is again subjective, but I find that it has a little bit more roll-off than pink noise. So if you're looking at the RTA application, pink noise is probably going to look like a straight flat line across the display. And so I would expect some drop-off on the high frequencies, but not too much. And I want that curve to be relatively smooth and flat without any major peaks or valleys in it. I don't want it to look like a mountain range. I want it to be smooth with maybe some gentle rolling hills and overall kind of sloping downward towards the high frequencies. Obviously, for the best results, I would suggest that you use an application like Smart, or I'd suggest that you would use at least a proper calibration microphone, which is a microphone that should have very flat response that you can trust for your measurements. And so, a couple tips for you there, friends. And I would suggest that if you just use one subwoofer system or cluster your subwoofers together into a single physical group, you'll get more even bass coverage throughout your room, throughout your venue, and you have a better sounding show. It's tragic when you're sitting there mixing a band and it sounds really good where you're standing, and then you decide to walk across the room and you realize that, wow, some people are just getting nailed with bass, while other people it sounds really thin. And in those cases, you just have to make some real compromises when mixing the band. I like my bands to sound good from one side of the room to the other. And of course, depending upon the room acoustics, it'll work with you or against you, but you can do what you can do with the loudspeaker placement to make the best of your room. And so I wish you well. I hope that tip works well for you. I hope you enjoy the video, and if you do, if you subscribe, I think that would be really cool. Meanwhile, enjoy, good luck with your shows, and I hope to see you again on another episode of Sound Advice.